Power BI and how to enable the users to drive their own reports. For those of you who are already using Power BI, this should make your life a little easier in the end. For those of you who are just new, this is a little bit on the intermediate side, but it's being presented in a way that I hope you'll find useful and actually helpful as far as deciding how you want to go about learning Power BI and what steps you want to take next. So a little bit about me. I'm a former past board member. I've been working with data and SQL Server and Power BI and SSIS and every other form you can think for the last 19 years. I love Power BI. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm available for any questions you have after this webinar at this email address, rabramson@pragmaticworks.com. I'll also be providing at the end of the session a link where you can download a copy of the file that we're going to be using today. So dynamic reporting is a way that we can tell people more about their business without having to go through the daily changes of users coming and saying, well, can I look at something this way? Can I look at something that way? As Power BI is growing more popular, more and more users are trying to use the reports to find real actionable data that they can use to run their business. It's not enough to just have an old style report anymore where they just download it to Excel and then find an analyst to go and change everything for them. Users want to be able to look at the report on the web service, or if you're showing it on a local server, and really be able to understand what they need to know to get that day's work done. In the past, reports were pretty standard. We used a variety of Crystal or SSRS. Basically, users were looking to learn how did they do that day or the month before. They wanted to know what's actionable, but usually that couldn't come from an SSRS report or a Crystal report or a custom one. Usually they would take that data and then do analysis on it. So what they would end up doing is most of the time they'd end up downloading to Excel and then doing their data analysis in Excel. We don't want them to have to do that anymore. So users, they don't want to have an analyst to do things for themselves. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a spoiler alert, they're still going to do it that way. Some of them are, hopefully not all of them. So today we're going to learn how to let the users drive the report. They know what they need, they know what they want, and they don't want to have to go through a zillion pages to get to what they want, or to have to take the data you give them and shape it in a different way. So the techniques we're going to use today are going to be Whatif Parameters, slicer tables, measures utilizing switch, which is, for you newer people, something we'll show as we go along, and data that's been unpivoted so that we can look at it in an entirely different way. The report we're using today is using AdventureWorks data, but I have updated it by generating new data that's got recent dates on it. I've added 5 million rows so that you can see that it actually will function with your own data when you try and do this. And I may have gone a little bit overboard on how many dynamic techniques will be on one page. Normally you'll do one, maybe two. I've done the whole page of them. So let's get started. Our first technique that we're going to use today is called a Whatif parameter. Basically, what you're doing is allowing your users to input a parameter at runtime the way they might have back in the day when they loaded parameters in a static report that you were running. Now, this is really useful for them because they might not want to see all the data at one time. They're only looking for the top things that really matter to them. So one of the ways we do that is often by letting people see the top however many records that they want to see. In the past, we used to put in like slicers that might show them 5, 10, 15, 20, or just have a static amount of top 20 of this, top 15 of that. But with Whatif parameters, they can use however many records of something that they want to see. So the first thing that they do is you're going to click on the new parameter, Whatif, on the modeling toolbar. I have a picture of it up here where it says new parameter. Then we're going to rename it to something new that's useful for us. In this case, I'm just calling it top records. And then 3, I'll be adding measures that use the Whatif parameter. And I have an example of that right here. This is the normal page that just has nothing added to it. This is what you might see if you just started dragging things in so that your users could see the normal report things. There's some slicers up here. You can slice to see what you want, change the data. All the visualizations will work with each other just like usual. But if we go to enhanced visualizations, what we can see here is I've already made the top end parameter, but let me show you how I do it just so you can see very quickly. I click this new parameter just like we saw on our slide. I rename it top records, if I can type today. And then I would just hit OK at this point. And what it gives me is this table right here, this top records. Now, the great thing about what I can do with this top records now is I can add a slicer. Let me scoot that to the back so that we can get to the slicer. And I can just drag in this top records. And now I can actually add a number of how many records I want to see. Now you see it didn't do anything at first. We need a measure that tells what we're going to do and what we're using it for. And I'm going to actually bring that in a little bit. But for now, you see how you can add the top end. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a top end measure, which makes sense, right? We want to know the number of records we want to see, and we want to know what we're going to look at them by. In this case, and you'll see this later in the presentation, what I've said is, hey, I want to see the top 5 records, but I also want to decide what I want to see it by. And I'm going to give you a real quick preview of this, and then we'll go through that as we go along so you understand how I did it. Here we see an example of the top end with 5 records. I'm going to go ahead and change this. Let's show 7 records. And you'll see the column below is changing. It's now got 7 records showing. It's now got 3. And I'll explain the rest of it to you later, but this is how you can see how this can be very useful to you. If you've got a real quick need to know what what are my top sales for the day? Where's our greatest risk for the day? You can use this and find easily what you need to see. The next technique we're going to use is slicer tables. And now feel free to ask some questions if you have them as we go along. I won't be able to answer any of them till the end, but I know that I'm going pretty fast and introducing a lot, especially for those of you who are brand new to Power BI. And as I said, there will be a copy of the file later, so if you want to just go over it and look and see how we did things, you'll be able to do that. So the first thing we're going to do for a slicer table is we just create a new table. Pretty simple, just hit enter data, enter the data you want in your table. And we're making categories with this. So I want to look at things by what are my products that are selling well for the day, what promotions are doing well, what promotion categories are doing well. These are, again, AdventureWorks categories. You'll probably have something entirely different. And by region, I've chosen. So then the next thing I do is I'm going to add a relationship to the table that I'm using to join these on. And you'll see this again in a second as well. Basically, anytime you add a slicer table, you're going to want to have a relationship to the main table you're using. And then I just make a slicer out of it. Really easy. And it does a lot for you. And again, let me show you that finished file and you'll be able to see how that works for us. This here is the slicer table in question we're talking about. It's connected to the dynamic table, which is something you'll see later. But as you can see, watch right now as the columns suddenly change on the dynamic visualizations down below. We went from looking at products to looking at promotions. Now we'll look at categories. And now there's only 2 records because there's only 2 different categories. Or I can look at it by region. Let's see my top 5 regions for the day. Again, this is a way that you can prevent yourself from having to rewrite extra filters, from having to teach your users how to use filters, from having to create extra even reports that just look at the specific items that a specific power user might want to see. And your users won't have to download things to Excel to filter to these categories that they only want to see. Now, the way we can change not just what categories we're looking at, but what metrics those categories are looking at is by using something called switch. Switch is just a DAX function. You can use it in a measure. And again, you'll be able to look at the example of this to better understand it later. But basically what we're doing here is we're just saying, okay, I have a slicer here. I want to know what value has been chosen. And then depending on what they've chosen, I'm going to switch which metric I'm going to show to the user. And once again, let me show you how that looks. Here we have that same metric with the 3 different choices, and the 2 charts below, watch how they switch. Now I'm looking at sales amount. Now I'm looking at unit price or product cost. And I can also still change on the other axis as well. So now comes the tricky part. How do we get that all to work? And it seems pretty confusing at first if you haven't done this before, but it actually turns out to be really easy. So let's just look at the first thing we do is we add a unique index to our fact table, whatever that might be. That's your query that has all the data in it. Let me see, here we go. Now basically this is what you see when you open the Power Query edit. And what we want to look at in here is we want to look at how do I take this table that has all this stuff in it and turn it into something that I can just use. So the first thing we're going to do, according to what we just looked at, is we're going to make a reference to that table. And this is just a copy of the table. It's not even a real copy. It's just a reference to the other table. And we're going to rename it to Dynamic Axis here. And now the next thing you'll see on our list here is we're going to add a unique column. This one does have a unique index column. We're making the reference copy. We've renamed it. And now we're going to select that index column and the columns we want to turn into categories. So that means, say I have a sales department, maybe a sales group, maybe region, and maybe I'm even a manufacturer, so I have plant things are made at. And those are all categories I want to look at when I look at my data. So I would choose those. In this case, though, we're just choosing index, product name, promotion category, and sales region. I'm going to remove the other columns just by right-clicking, and there I go. Now the next thing I'm going to do is highlight the columns except for the index. And then I'm going to click on unpivot columns, and you'll see how this turns into something entirely different than what it was just a second ago. So I've got them all highlighted, going to transform, and I unpivoted them. Now you'll see that I have not just one line, but now I suddenly have, for each index row, I have 4 lines because I chose 4 different categories. And what this does is this index column that we have here is going to be a relationship to the internet sales table. So we'll be able to go back and forth between them just like they were any other 2 tables. But now these are not columns anymore, they're values. Oops, sorry about that. Now we're going to add one more column to this conditional table, and this is what we're going to use as an index so that we can connect to the dynamic table that we made earlier for the measure, and that way we can have a good, clean relationship. Let me just show you how we do this very quickly. It's super easy. We go to Add Column. We're going to choose this table, this column that has the attributes we want to have indexes to, and we're going to say Column from Examples from Selection. And super easy, we just say 1, 2, 3, 4. It fills it all in for it. I'm going to call this attribute index, and I'm going to hit OK. And now I have a column that will allow me to connect to my slicer table. Now this is for the more advanced among you. You don't have to know how to do this, so please don't panic if you're brand new to Power BI. This is for those who like to see things in M. Basically, it just tells step by step what's just happened there. We've removed duplicates, which I think I did actually by accident. Oops, I keep going past. And then we've unpivoted the other columns. We've added a column, and that's it. That's all there is to it. Now, what did we just do? We flipped the table on its side, basically. We unpivoted the columns we wanted to make into categories. So we've made a really long, narrow table now. So whereas we started with 5 million rows in the other table, we now have 20 million rows in this table, which seems like an awful lot of rows, but Power BI is really good at handling narrow, long tables. So you'll find that it still performs very quickly. And we've also added a new index to create the relationship that we need. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add those relationships, because nothing will work unless we have the relationships made. The really unique thing here about how we make this work is we're going to have a dynamic relationship between the internet sales and the dynamic axes table. And we're going to do that by having a bidirectional relationship. Now, bidirectional is something you want to be really careful with when you're using Power BI. If it's used in incorrect ways or used too often, it can really slow down a file. But in this case, it's definitely what we want to have to do. And then we're also going to connect our dynamic slicer using the index we made at the end of the table when we created that. So you'll see how that matches as well. Okay, now I've gone to this file because it's already got the unpivoted data loaded, and you really don't want to sit through 20 million rows loaded. It doesn't actually take that long, but we don't have the time for that. So basically now I have this dynamic access table, which is really great. I've gone into my relationships. As you can see here, it hasn't automatically detected what we need. It does see that there's an index here that matches, and it's created a one-way relationship, but what we need to do is go in here and change that to both ways. And then we need to connect the slicer, and now everything should work. Of course, we're not using that dynamic column yet. So let me show you exactly how that will work. Right now in this table, we're using your typical hierarchy. This is how you would normally see most files. What you would do is drill down, oh, I want to see this, or this, or this. And that's how you go between your records. What we're going to do is instead create a special calculated column that is going to allow us to get rid of all that. But for now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect up the columns with the switch, which has the different metrics that you want to look at so that we can choose, hey, and this is actually a more traditional Power BI function. People have been doing this for a long time. You might have 5 or 6 or 10 switches, and you'll notice that the more you add, the slower your file is going to get. Unfortunately, that's still the case here. There's nothing I can do to fix that. But because we're using a good clean file and it's using a pretty narrow table, even though it's pretty long, it works pretty well. And let me show you what that measure looks like inside Power BI. So this is the switch. It's very simple. It's just we're switching values whenever one of the metrics is chosen in the slicer. We switch to the one it matches. If it's product cost, we looked at the product cost, sales amount, and so on. And you can see that in action here. When I click on sales amount, this will change to show the sales amount. And now it's changed to show the product cost. Now, the next thing that you may have noticed is even though it showed those things, it was really hard to tell what I was showing. It was confusing. So what you can do is you can create another measure. And what this is it's a title measure. In some of the latest versions of Power BI, we can finally have the ability to change our table names based on what they are, which is just huge. So the first thing we do is we click on the table on your right-hand side under Fields, or I'm sorry, on your slicer actually, and then you choose the paintbrush under Visualizations. And under Title, you'll see the 3 ellipses, and you choose Conditional Formatting as your choice. Under Based on Field, you choose your table name measure, and then it changes. Let me show you how that works. So here I have this switch based on these metrics here. I'm going to go Tooltip, or not Tooltip, Title. I'm not on the, there it is. And what I can do is hit Conditional Formatting by clicking on those 3 ellipses. And I get my choice of any fields, and see I have these titles that I made. And here is a dynamic pie chart title. And I think I chose the wrong one, but that's okay. Oh, I haven't added the other slicer yet. I'm sorry, you'll see. Let me show you how this works in a different one because that's not very helpful to you. Okay, let's do that again. We're going to choose that dynamic pie chart title. And now, as you can see, when I change something, the actual name of this visualization is changing so that the user can see what they want. And suddenly, it's a lot less like a report and a lot more like an app. This will allow your users to actually just go to exactly what they want to see. It saves you from having to go to the trouble of creating different metrics that show the same thing just so you can show things by different categories or making them drill down through the hierarchy, which is something that sometimes a lot of users have difficulty with, especially those who aren't real tech savvy. Which is then why you get a lot of people making Excel that shows how to do something, what something is, when it basically is the same information. So here you go. This is the happy people at the end. And now I'm going to go in and show you the end file here. Oh. If it will open up. And I'm happy to take questions. So I see you're curious about what was being selected, and I'm sorry, I missed when you asked that. Can you be a little bit more specific about what you wanted to know? Okay, so here, for example, we're looking at the pie chart in the left-hand side. What I had done in the previous example here was I have my sales amount by region or product or whatever. But what I'm doing now is instead of just using these values like internet sales, sales region, product name, what I can do is this new dynamic column that we made that was the kind of the highlight of the whole presentation. I can bring that in instead. I can remove all of these other columns here. And as you can see now, I can change what's being shown. I'm doing this all over again, kind of in one for you. And then what I go in and do is I say, okay, I've changed what's being shown, but how can I show my users what I've been shown? So I go to the paintbrush here, choose title, and then under conditional titles, I find the measure that says dynamic pie chart measure title, and it changes. So now when I click on a metric, it shows me that metric, sales amount. Click on unit price, it shows me unit price. But I can also change it to look at that by product instead. Also, this is a good example of why you should never use pie charts in your reports that are going to have any amount of data in them. That's a topic for another time. I can do the same thing down below where it makes even a little bit more sense because now we have this top 5 being shown. We have a dynamic column, but we don't know what's showing. So let me show you that one. And here again, we're showing all of these different things by this dynamic column. So I click on my paintbrush, I go to my title, click conditional formatting, find the measure that I've made for the dynamic table with top N, which is the number of records that I'm showing. Click OK. And now I can see here's the top 5 records for this. I can change it. 7, I can type in here and change the number. 2. So your users that are used to looking at like an app and saying, I just want to see this many of that, can go in here now and they can say, just show me the data I want in the way I want to see it. You probably wouldn't have this much on one page. I want to emphasize again that we're looking at a data set that has 5 million rows in it, and this is pretty instant. So you don't have to worry about things being slow. Let me see what else we have here as far as questions. You can't do some of the same things if you're using just direct query. You can't mix the tables unless you're using the service and using the combined method. So the answer is kind of no to that. But you can definitely import the data from an SSAS database or from SQL Server. And yes, you can get a copy of the sample BI file that I'm working with. Let me show you. If you click on the link that you see now, that will actually download a copy for you. It's from our Pragmatic Works OneNote or OneDrive. And if anyone is unable to get that to work for them, just give me an email and I will make sure that I get you a copy. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to read these and they're a little bit hard for me to read in my, for some reason it's coming through in tiny text on my window. The happy medium between using DAX and using an external database. Solution. That's a good question. So I've been asked, what's the happy medium between using DAX and using an external database solution, such as file size or activity? I think what you saw here was some actually pretty complex DAX. And as you can see, it was a big file set. It worked pretty quickly. I can tell you that the file that we just used was not optimized at all, and it was about 120 megabytes. It could be a lot better than that. I would also recommend using the Power BI service to host this, in which case you really don't have much of an issue with it at all. If you're looking to be, maybe 100 million rows, that might be a different issue, but basically you can import this data from any external database. Power BI is great about importing data from really anywhere. There's about 1 million APIs, so whatever database solution you're using, you can probably import the data into Power BI and create a report like this. Okay, let me put I'm gonna see if I can, hold on, let me get that link for you, and I will see if we can follow up, and anyone who wants it, please email me at rabramson@pragmaticworks.com and I will make sure you get that file. In your fact table, yes. The query that we have here really isn't a fact table. It's kind of a mix that was just brought in as a query, which is actually what I find is most of what I see when I go to clients. You'll be provided a data set and use that. So what I've done here is I've just joined the fact table to some of the attributes to create the data set that we use today, because it's a kind of more realistic vision of what you actually get in most cases, unless you have complete control of your data. Oh, good question. The difference between a measure and a calculated column is pretty simple. The calculated column, let me show you again what we've done there. Calculated column is an actual column in the table that we've created here, which is actually a query. But what we're saying here, especially in this calculated dynamic column, is we're saying, okay, show me what metric I want to look at. And in this case, we're just saying what I'm choosing to look at, and this is by the category. Usually a calculated column is going to be similar to a measure in that you'll have some kind of calculation in it, but it's static for that table basically throughout. You don't want to put your measures inside your tables usually, just for the sake of organization, but a measure is very similar in how it looks, and that's probably a whole nother webinar for a little bit more beginner stuff, but that's actually a very good question. Can I update the chart headings to reflect what is being selected? Oh, yes. We can, and I believe I showed you how to do that probably after you asked that. Some of the features, as far as the only feature that's just pretty brand new is the ability to change the table names. Everything else here you could do with probably going back towards the beginning of the year. Oh, would you like to see, someone asked to see the DAX for the dynamic top end, and sure. Oh, that's not it. Oh, yes it is, I'm sorry. So basically what I've done here is I have my top end table, so I'm able to say what's the selected value of the top end table, so I know how many records I'm changing. I look to see if the dynamic column is in scope, which is the dynamic column is the calculated column we made. This is a little bit more advanced. If you're feeling confused because you're new to Power BI, don't worry about this part. You can do this without it being so complicated. And then I choose my measure here that has the total amount for sales. And I just say, what's the rank of it, using rank n, which is a DAX function. And I'm just saying if the rank is greater than the number selected, then show it. If not, show blank. And then the way I make that work is by going to the, let me show you, filters, and I just say if it's not blank, show it. So it only shows those records that are actually included in the data set for that number. Elaine asked if I should use the dimension table to create this unpivoted table. Yes, if you have clean dimension tables, that's probably actually what you want to do. And I'm looking here. We still have 20 minutes to go. I've been going faster than I was supposed to. Users can use this with tabular models. Again, you would probably do an import query from the tabular model, probably using DAX, or you can use the database that the tabular model was created from and use SQL as well. Can we build a dynamic variable using the Power BI service? Somewhat, not really. I mean, we are using a dynamic variable with the Whatif parameter, which is what we showed at the beginning where we said, but really the only thing we're doing here is numbers. So yes and no. It's a long way from where Power BI needs to be. I believe eventually they'll have more ability to make more changes with parameters at runtime, but right now we just have this number parameter. Oh, actually, yes, there was a question in here about could we show the sums of others values in the top end, and someone, I can't remember who off the top of my head, posted a wonderful article about doing just this with the others just a few days ago. Might have been Guy in a Cube, but if you want to email about that to me, Michelle, I will be happy to email you that link to what I just saw that explains how to do that. I believe that Whatif parameters go to 50 records. It was a question if they went over 20, and the answer is yes. There's a question here about how about security. Security is basically normally going to be handled in RLS. So if you're using RLS and bring that into the Power BI service, security will work exactly as it does for any of your other Power BI. So no matter how you twist and turn these tables, they'll still use the same security model. and users should only be able to see what they're allowed to see. It's a question about how can I get to the filter window next to the visualizations and fields. That is something that's in a newer version of Power BI. It's not that new anymore, but let me show you. If you go to Options and Settings, Options, we can go down to Report Settings, and we have a new Enable the updated filter pane and show filters in the visual filter for this report, and that's how you get that filter window to open. I hope that answers that question. There's another question about how I created the dynamic title. Let me show you a few of those. I made a bunch of dynamic titles for this, and actually, once you start making dynamic titles, I'll tell you, you can't stop. I use them for not just this, but if I'm using maybe a date slicer, I'll often put the min and max date in a date title, so that when I'm looking at a visualization, it might say sales for this date period or sales for between these two dates. And users find that very helpful because they don't always notice what they have in the slicers, especially if they're often filters to the side. But basically what I do is I look at my variables for things I want to show in that dynamic title. Like in this case, I want to show the top number because I'm using this top 5. I want to know what the category is that I've chosen for, in this case, for the dynamic category. So again, I'm using this selected value. Selected value is wonderful. Anytime you're using a slicer that can only have one choice, and let me show you what I mean by that. When I look at a slicer, selection controls, if I put single select on, then I know that this is going to work. If I haven't used single select, I'm going to have to say if has one value to check that I only have one value selected. But that's again for another webinar in the future. You're giving me some great ideas. Thank you. So basically, I choose what I want to show in the as variables, and then I just literally return just a title and my variable, and that's all there is to it. It's very, very simple. You can use variables for anything, variables for the date, variables for what records they've chosen, and they're all very similar. You'll see a pattern here. Everything is just a variable or two variables, and then returning with just static and dynamic mixed together. Here's another one. Here's one where the only static part is the by. And each time you just go to the table in question, go to your title, click the ellipses, choose your measure, and this is here's the right one for this one. And there it is. It just pops right up. It's very simple. Again, a lot of people are saying they can't download the file, and if anyone wants the file, please just send me a quick email to rabramson@pragmaticworks.com, and I will make sure that I send you the file personally. Here's someone that says, I previously used the same method to achieve the dynamic categories visualizations, but I stumbled on doing through for the use of DAX, which is more effective and efficient. Unpivoting a query editor like this or through a DAX calculated table? Thanks. That's a good question, and the answer is it depends. If you're using a very large data set and you have a lot of categories, the unpivot method is definitely going to be faster and easier to do. If it's a smaller data set, you can usually do it with exactly the way you said with the using DAX in a calculated table. I recently worked on a report that had actually both on one page, so there are definitely use cases for each. I guess I would just say just try them, see which works better for you. Creating the unpivoted table, once you've done it a couple times, literally takes a minute or two, so it's definitely worth trying to see if that works. It's actually sometimes faster than writing the DAX. Okay, and then I have a question. Is your slicer table affected only by that visual with the Whatif parameter, or is that because of the modeling that I did? That's a good question as well. I believe you're talking about this table here, the top 5 records. Let me reread what you just wrote here. That because of the modeling I did. Yeah, this has nothing to, this is both to do with the modeling and the Whatif parameter, so it's kind of tricky. The modeling is in use here because if you look at the columns here, I used to have, let me show you on the normal page so you can remember how this was. This is how you would normally show this table, this sales region here, and you can see it's a hierarchy, and it's got all the stuff that we had in the other one. And generally the way people go through this is they just, go up and down in the hierarchy. So, and then you would look to say, okay, here's the part of the hierarchy I was looking at. But it can also, as you see, especially if you have a lot of different categories, it can get really confusing. And this is generally the actual table. I mean, 9 times out of 10, you're going to just export the data out of this and do what you want to do with it, which is the reason that I started doing this actually. Although I know I'm not the first person to do it. So what you're doing here is using the modeling to say, okay, no, just show me this, whatever column I choose based on the slicer choice I make. And now if I'm an end user, I don't have to wait for someone to find me just this data, or I don't have to try and filter it out. And if I want to look at that level of what's a hierarchy, this really isn't a hierarchy, but if it was, then I would be able to see just the level I wanted just by choosing a slicer value instead of having to kind of dig down and look for it. I hope that answered that question. So it's both, it's the top 5 or the top 7 or 9 or whatever I choose, and it's also the dynamic column. And in the case of the pie chart, it's not just the dynamic column, it's also the measure switch, which is choosing a different measure. The question, is it possible to have a record of the session? Yes, it will be available on the Pragmatic Works website for free. And some more asking about the file, and yes, definitely I will send you the file. That's a good question. Jackie is asking about a slicer table. If we're using a tabular model, which my company is doing, we would need the developer to create said slicer table and add to the tabular model, correct? Yes. That would be the only way to kind of mimic this in SSIS. But if you wanted to do it as far as using an import from your tabular model, you could easily do that and still create the slicer inside Power BI. So the answer is yes and no, I guess. But yeah, if you want this all to be done in the tabular model, that would be how you would do it. And I'm looking here to see if I got all the questions. Oh, someone posted the top N article from SQL BI that I was talking about earlier. Thank you. It's, by the way, a really excellent article, and I would recommend everyone read it if you're involved in the higher level of Power BI. Oh, here's a great question, and one I can't answer in the way I'd love to. He says, when using the dynamic slicer, can you update the chart headings to match what you're showing? And the answer is, as of this point, no. I recommend going to the Power BI wish list and searching for and voting for that. Had I thought of it, I would have included a link here. The answer is, at this point, we can't dynamically name columns, which is just a shame, but eventually. But that's also the reason that you want to make sure that you're renaming the table to be more descriptive of what you're actually showing. Yeah, and another couple questions asking if I can change the headers in the chart, and the answer is still no, unfortunately. What I often will do is on the dynamic column, I will actually replace the name of that column with just a dot, so that it looks like there's nothing there, because that's better. If you see what I'm talking about. See, now if I've changed it to just a dot, it no longer seems like I'm looking at some kind of dynamic name. It's just whatever is showing up above. So it's not really changed the column header, but if the column header is the only thing on the left-hand side and the title is right above it, it kind of mimics it. And can the charts be updated automatically if you're pulling directly from a DB, or is it a copy of the data at the time? If you're using direct query, this won't work quite in the same way. So the answer is no. But if you're just doing a import from the DB, you can definitely still do that, and it's not hard to do. And the answer is no to John as far as the RLS being on the column level instead of the row level. And I'm looking through the questions. I think I've got all the questions. Let me just display my email address again, because people are, I'm going to type it in here, and then I'll just display that slide again as well. And here's my email address right here, rabramson@pragmaticworks.com. And I really want to thank you all for attending. This has been a really great session, and I think that I can see that we can look at in the future maybe going to both a simpler version for those of you who are a little bit less experienced, and maybe going into a real deep dive into some of the DAX in a future episode as well. Thanks everyone for attending, and please, again, if you want to email me, I will be happy to send both the presentation and the Power BI to you.
All right, Robin, and thank you so much for hosting. We really appreciate it. And I see a couple of questions about will this be recorded? Yes, it will be recorded. You guys will receive the recording tomorrow in your inbox, probably around noon. You guys should receive an email from me. If you guys are looking for any of our other webinars, there are on our website under free webinars. If you go to the resource tab and then click free webinars, you'll see all of our archived webinars there. And you can also find our webinars on YouTube at Pragmatic Works. If you guys have any questions, like Robin said, please feel free to reach out to her or myself. And like I said, if you guys are looking for the recording, you guys will receive that tomorrow in your email. And I know a couple of people had questions about Azure Data Week. If you guys are still interested in Azure Data Week and learning many different Azure topics, please feel free to visit azuredataweek.com, and you can still register and get all the recordings from there. Thank you again, Robin, for hosting. We appreciate you guys for coming in and listening to this session. We guys hope you enjoyed it and hope you guys have a good rest of your day.